It was one of those rare, tranquil afternoons where time seemed to slow down. The late summer sunlight filtered softly through the living room window, casting warm golden hues across the furniture. I sat on the sofa, cradling a cup of chamomile tea, savoring the calm. The house was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, but I welcomed the peace. After a hectic week of classes and errands, this was the moment of solitude I had been longing for. The faint creak of footsteps interrupted my reverie. Turning my head, I saw my father standing in the doorway. His tall figure, usually so relaxed, was rigid. The lines on his face appeared deeper than usual, and his lips were pressed into a firm line. His hands, usually animated when he spoke, hung motionless by his sides. "Anna," he said, his voice steady but unusually low. "We need to talk." A sense of unease began to stir within me. "Sure, Dad," I replied, setting my tea down on the coffee table. "What's going on?" He walked into the room, each step deliberate, and sat down across from me. His gaze avoided mine at first, flickering to the family portrait on the wall, then to the floor. After what felt like an eternity, he finally looked up, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "I've been meaning to tell you this for a while," he began, his tone calm yet loaded with tension. "But I didn't know how. And now, well, I think you deserve to know the truth." My stomach tightened. The truth? The words hung in the air like an ominous storm cloud. My father wasn't one to be overly dramatic, so whatever he was about to say, I knew it had to be serious. He inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling like he was preparing for a plunge into icy waters. "Anna, you remember the woman you met last week? At the coffee shop? The one I introduced as an old friend?" I nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "Yes, the one with the short blonde hair, Vanessa, right? She seemed nice." "She is," he said quickly, then paused, his jaw tightening. "But she's more than just a friend. She and we were in a relationship once, a long time ago, before I met your mother." I blinked, confused. "Okay," I said cautiously. "That's not such a big deal. People have exes. Dad, what's the problem?" He hesitated again, the silence stretching unbearably. Finally, he spoke, each word dropping like a stone. "The problem is, we've stayed in touch. Over the years." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. "You've stayed in touch?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, his voice growing firmer, "that we've maintained a relationship, not romantic, not anymore, but a connection. One that I've kept from your mother and from you." The weight of his confession hit me like a tidal wave. The peaceful afternoon I had been enjoying just minutes ago now felt like a distant memory. My chest tightened, and my mind raced with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. "Why would you do that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why would you keep something like this a secret?" His eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his expression. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of what it would do to our family, to your mother, to you." I shook my head, struggling to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the one sitting in front of me now. "So you've been lying to us, all this time." "It's not that simple," he said, his voice pleading. "Vanessa was a big part of my life once, and while our relationship ended, the bond we shared didn't just disappear. I didn't want to hurt anyone by cutting her off completely." "But you didn't want to hurt anyone by telling the truth, either," I shot back, anger creeping into my tone. He sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Anna, I know this is a lot to take in. I didn't tell you this to upset you. I couldn't keep it from you any longer." I I stood up, needing to put distance between us. The room suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in. "I need a minute," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "But please, Anna, try to understand." I didn't respond. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, confusion, all swirling together into a storm I couldn't control. I walked out of the room and up the stairs to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me, leaning against it. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. This couldn't be real. The man I had always admired for his honesty and integrity had been hiding something this big? And Vanessa, the woman who had smiled so warmly at me just a week ago. What role had she really played in all of this? As I sank onto my bed, the full weight of the situation began to settle over me. My peaceful afternoon had been shattered, and in its place was a reality I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The walls of my bedroom offered no comfort. I paced back and forth, my thoughts spiraling. The man who had always been my rock, my moral compass, had hidden something so monumental. Worse, he had justified it as if it were an act of love. I threw myself onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping for clarity. None came. My father's words echoed in my mind. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But isn't that exactly what he's done? Anger bubbled to the surface, hot and uncontrollable. I thought of my mother, her unwavering dedication to our family, her trust in my father. Did she suspect anything? Did she know about Vanessa and choose to ignore it? Or was she as blindsided as I was? I reached for my phone, the impulse to call her overwhelming. But what would I say? That her husband, the man she had spent over 2 decades with, had been emotionally entangled with another woman? That he had kept it a secret from both of us? My thumb hovered over her contact, but I couldn't press the button. "No," I whispered to myself. "Not yet." I needed answers. The next morning, I woke with the same heaviness in my chest. The once comforting sunlight streaming through the curtains now felt intrusive, highlighting the chaos in my mind. Over breakfast, my father was uncharacteristically quiet. He sipped his coffee, avoiding my gaze. The air between us was thick, suffocating. "I need to talk to her," I said suddenly, breaking the silence. He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "To who?" "Vanessa," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to hear her side of this." "Anna, that's not necessary," he said quickly, setting his mug down. "This is between you and me. She doesn't need to be dragged into it." "Don't you think she's already in it?" I countered, anger creeping into my voice. "She's been in it for years, hasn't she? This isn't just between you and me. Dad, you made it about her the moment you decided to keep her in your life." He opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it, as if realizing he had no defense. "Fine," he said finally, his tone resigned. "But please, be careful." Vanessa lived on the other side of town, in a small but elegant apartment complex. As I approached her door, my heart pounded so loudly I was certain she would hear it from the other side. I knocked twice. A few moments later, the door opened, and there she was, Vanessa, the woman who had unknowingly become the center of my family's unraveling. "Anna," she said, surprised but not entirely shocked. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated, glancing down the hallway as if weighing her options. Finally, she stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. Her apartment was tastefully decorated, filled with soft, neutral tones and carefully chosen artwork. It was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" she offered, her voice polite but cautious. "No, thank you," I replied, sitting on the edge of the pristine white sofa. Vanessa took a seat across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I assume this is about your father, she said, her tone measured. Yes, I said bluntly. I know about your relationship, and I know it didn't end when he married my mom. Her expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. I see, she said softly. Why? I demanded, my voice rising. Why would you keep this going? Do you have any idea what this has done to our family? She looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. Anna, I understand why you're upset, but you have to believe me when I say that I never intended to hurt anyone. That's what he said too, I snapped. She flinched, and for the first time, I saw something other than calm in her eyes, guilt. Your father and I, she began, her voice trembling slightly. We had a connection. Even after we ended things, it was hard to let go completely. I thought we could remain friends, that it wouldn't affect anyone. But now I see I was wrong. Friends? I repeated, disbelief dripping from my words. You stayed friends with a married man for over 20 years? And you thought that wouldn't hurt anyone? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said quietly. But I want you to know that it wasn't about trying to take him away from your family. It was about holding on to something that once meant everything to me. Her words, while honest, only fueled my anger. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You've managed to tear apart everything my father spent years pretending was perfect. I stood up, my legs shaky but determined. Stay away from him, I said, my voice firm. Stay away from my family. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind me echoing in the hallway. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying every word Vanessa had said. Her guilt seemed genuine, but that didn't change the damage that had been done. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw my father standing by the window, his silhouette tense. He was waiting for me, and I knew he would want to know what had happened. But I wasn't ready to face him, not yet. Instead, I walked inside, past the living room where he stood, and straight up to my room, shutting the door. I leaned against it, my chest heaving. I had confronted Vanessa. I had said what I needed to say, but the questions still lingered. Unanswered and relentless. How could I ever trust my father again? And what would happen if my mother found out the truth? The house was silent when I finally emerged from my room later that evening. My father was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his hands clasped in front of him, staring into the distance. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. As much as I wanted to avoid him, I knew it wasn't possible. The confrontation with Vanessa had left too many unanswered questions swirling in my mind, and I couldn't carry them alone anymore. Dad, I said softly, stepping into the kitchen. He looked up, his face etched with exhaustion and something else. Guilt. Anna? He replied, his voice hesitant. Did you speak to her? I nodded, taking the seat across from him. I did, and she told me everything. He closed his eyes and sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. I should have been the one to tell you, he said. It wasn't fair to put you in that position. No, it wasn't, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. But you did. And now I need to know the rest of the story. All of it. For a moment, he didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the table as if the answers were etched into the wood grain. Finally, he took a deep breath and began. Vanessa and I met when we were in our 20s, he said, his voice steady but distant, as though he were reliving a memory. We were young, and things were intense. At the time, I thought she was the one. but life had other plans. He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. We broke up after a couple of years. I moved on, or at least I thought I did. Then I met your mother, and everything changed. She was everything I didn't know I needed, grounded, loving, selfless. So why did you keep Vanessa in your life? I asked, unable to hide the bitterness in my tone. It wasn't intentional, he said quickly. When Vanessa reached out years later, I thought it would just be a casual catch-up. But as we talked, I realized how much I still cared for her. Not romantically, but as a person. She was going through a difficult time, and I felt like I couldn't just turn my back on her. And what about Mom? I pressed. Did she ever know about this? His face darkened. No, he admitted. I didn't tell her because I didn't want to hurt her. I thought I was protecting her. I shook my head, my frustration mounting. Protecting her by lying to her, by keeping this other relationship alive behind her back? It wasn't like that, he said defensively. I never cheated on your mother. What Vanessa and I had was complicated, but it was never physical. It was just conversations, memories. Memories that should have stayed in the past. I shot back. Do you even realize what this has done to me? To us? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and helplessness. I know I've made mistakes, Anna, but please believe me when I say that I never meant to hurt you or your mother. I stood up, pacing the kitchen as anger and sadness warred within me. You didn't mean to hurt us, but you did, I said. You lied to us. You betrayed the trust we had in you. And for what? To hold on to some part of your past that you couldn't let go? It wasn't that simple, he insisted, standing now as well. Vanessa wasn't just a part of my past. She was a reminder of who I was before, of mistakes I made and lessons I learned. I thought keeping her in my life was a way to honor that, to not forget where I came from. That's not how it works. Dad, I snapped. You can't hold on to your past at the expense of your present. You can't keep secrets and expect everything to be fine. He didn't respond, his silence a tacit acknowledgement of his failure. Finally, I stopped pacing and faced him directly. Mom deserves to know, I said, my voice quieter but resolute. She has a right to the truth. No, he said immediately, his tone sharp. This would destroy her. Anna, like she doesn't need to know. It's better this way. Better for who? I asked. For you? So you don't have to deal with the consequences of your actions? For all of us, he said, his voice rising. Do you think I want this? Do you think I enjoy seeing the pain in your eyes, knowing I'm the one who put it there? I made a mistake. Anna. A mistake I've been paying for every day since I made it. I stared at him, my anger softening just enough to see the weight he was carrying. He wasn't just guilty, he was broken. But even so, I couldn't ignore the damage that had been done. You're right about one thing, I said finally. We can't go back and change what happened, but we can't keep pretending either. If you don't tell her, I will. His face fell, and for a moment, he looked older than I had ever seen him. Please, he said softly, almost begging. Let me handle this in my own way, in my own time. I hesitated, torn between my loyalty to my mother and the faint, flickering hope that my father could make things right. You have until the end of the week, I said firmly. If you don't tell her by then, I will. He nodded slowly, his head bowed as though he were carrying the weight of the world. As I walked back to my room, my mind churned with emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep, aching uncertainty. I had confronted Vanessa. I had confronted my father. But the hardest confrontation was yet to come. What would my mother do when she learned the truth? And would our family ever be the same again? The week dragged on like an endless tide, each day heavier than the last. The tension in the house was palpable. My father barely spoke. And when he did, it was with a cautiousness that only heightened my unease. He was a man on the edge, teetering between fear and resolve, and I was the one who had pushed him there. For my part, I avoided him as much as possible. Every interaction felt like a battle, his guilt against my anger, his excuses against my need for truth. By Thursday, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if he was going to follow through. "Dad," I said that evening, standing in the doorway of his study. He was seated at his desk, staring blankly at the open laptop in front of him. When he looked up, the dark circles under his eyes made him look years older. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Anna, this isn't easy for me." "It's not supposed to be easy," I snapped. "You've had years to figure this out. But you didn't. Now you're out of time." "I know," he said quietly, his voice laced with exhaustion. "I'll talk to her tomorrow. After dinner." His words brought a momentary sense of relief, but it was fleeting. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the shattering of the fragile foundation our family had been built on. Friday evening arrived too quickly, the hours slipping away like grains of sand through an hourglass. My mother had returned home earlier in the afternoon, cheerful as always, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Dinner was uneventful at first. My mother chatted about her work trip, sharing stories about the people she had met and the places she had visited. I forced a smile, nodding in all the right places, but inside, I was a bundle of nerves. My father, on the other hand, was visibly tense. He picked at his food, barely contributing to the conversation. My mother noticed. Of course. "David, are you feeling all right?" she asked, her tone concerned. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't press the issue. She turned her attention back to me, asking about school and my plans for the weekend. I answered mechanically. My focus split between her questions and the clock ticking ominously in the background. Finally, as the plates were cleared and the coffee brewed, my father cleared his throat. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice unsteady. "There's something I need to talk to you about." She looked up, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "What is it, David?" He glanced at me briefly, as if seeking reassurance, before returning his attention to her. "It's about Vanessa." My mother's smile faltered. "Vanessa? Your old friend?" "Yes," he said, pausing to steady himself. "She's more than just an old friend." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dread. "What are you talking about?" My father took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Vanessa and I, we were in a relationship before I met you, and after we got married, we stayed in touch." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. My mother's eyes widened, her face paling as she processed his confession. "You stayed in touch?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "What does that mean? David, were you cheating on me?" "No," he said quickly, his voice desperate. "It wasn't like that. We weren't involved that way. It was just conversations, emails, nothing physical. But you kept it from me," she said, her voice growing colder. You lied to me. David. For years. He nodded, his head bowed. I did. And I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting you. But I see now that I was wrong. Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. Protecting me? By hiding a part of your life? By keeping another woman in our marriage? It wasn't about her, he insisted. It was about me, about my own insecurities, my own inability to let go of the past. That's not an excuse, she said sharply. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? To know that all these years, I've been sharing you with someone else? Even if it wasn't physical, it was still a betrayal. I sat frozen in my chair, watching the scene unfold. I had prepared myself for this moment, or so I thought. But seeing my mother's pain and my father's desperation was more than I could handle. Elizabeth, he said, reaching for her hand. Please. I love you. I always have. What I did was wrong, but it doesn't change how much I care about you. She pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. I need time, she said, her voice breaking. I need to think about what this means for us. Without another word, she left the table, disappearing upstairs. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the house, followed by the quiet click of the bedroom door closing. My father slumped back in his chair, his face a mask of anguish. I've ruined everything, he muttered. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But another part of me, the part that still felt betrayed, couldn't bring myself to forgive him just yet. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. My mother didn't come back downstairs, and my father retreated to his study. I stayed in the living room, staring blankly at the television, unable to focus on anything. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours, replaying the events of the night in my head. The truth had been revealed, but the damage was done. Our family would never be the same. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in my mind. What happens now? The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The usual hum of morning routines was absent. No clinking dishes, no faint sound of the radio playing from the kitchen. The air was thick with the residue of last night's revelations. I walked downstairs to find my father sitting at the dining table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had likely gone cold. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped as though he'd aged years overnight. Good morning, I said softly, though it felt ridiculous to call it that. He looked up at me, his expression hollow. Morning, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Is Mom? I hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. She's still in the bedroom, he said. Didn't say much when I knocked earlier. Just said she needed time. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Sitting across from him, I reached for the words that had been tumbling through my mind all night. Dad, you did the right thing by telling her. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but it's better this way. He gave a bitter laugh. Better, Anna? I just broke my wife's heart. Our family might never recover from this. Maybe, I admitted. But keeping the truth buried would have been worse. At least now there's a chance for honesty, for rebuilding. He didn't respond, staring into the depths of his coffee as if it held the answers he so desperately sought. I waited until late afternoon before I finally worked up the courage to check on my mother. Her bedroom door was closed, and I stood outside for what felt like an eternity before lightly knocking. Mom? It's me, I said gently. Can I come in? There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't respond. But then her voice came, soft but firm. Come in. Anna. I opened the door to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, a box of tissues beside her and her eyes red from crying. Seeing her like that made my chest tighten with guilt, even though I knew none of this was my fault. "Hi," I said, sitting down beside her. "Hi," she replied, offering me a small, weary smile. "I guess last night was a lot." I nodded. "Yeah, it was. How are you feeling?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know. Part of me wants to scream, to throw things, to leave and never look back. But another part of me, I keep thinking about everything we've built together, the life we've shared, and I wonder if I can just throw that all away." "You don't have to decide right now," I said. "Take the time you need. Whatever you choose, it's okay. I just want you to be okay." She looked at me then, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Anna. I'm sorry you had to get caught up in this." "It's not your fault," I said quickly. "I love you, Mom. And I'll be here for you, no matter what." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you know." The days that followed were a blur of awkward silences and tentative attempts at normalcy. My mother avoided my father, retreating to her room or leaving the house for long walks. My father tried to give her space, but I could see the strain wearing on him. One evening, a few days later, my mother called me into the living room. She was seated on the couch, her posture calm but resolute. "I've made a decision," she said as I sat down beside her. I held my breath, waiting. "I'm not leaving," she said. "At least, not right now. I need time to process everything, but I'm not ready to walk away from this family. Not yet." A wave of relief washed over me, though I knew this wasn't the end of the conflict. "What about Dad?" I asked cautiously. She sighed. "We'll need to have a serious conversation about boundaries, about trust. If we're going to move forward, things have to change." "Do you think you can forgive him?" I asked hesitantly. She paused, her gaze distant. "I don't know, but I'm willing to try. For now." That evening, my parents sat together in the living room for the first time since the revelation. I stayed in my room, giving them the privacy they needed. I couldn't hear every word, but the low murmurs of their voices told me they were talking, really talking. When my father knocked on my door later that night, his face looked more peaceful than it had in days. "We're going to try," he said simply. I nodded, feeling a tentative hope stir within me. That's all you can do. The weeks that followed were far from perfect. There were moments of tension, of tears and raised voices. But there were also moments of progress, shared meals, quiet conversations, small gestures of kindness that hinted at the possibility of healing. For me, the experience changed the way I saw my parents. They weren't just my mother and father anymore. They were flawed, complex people, struggling to navigate their own emotions and mistakes. It made me realize that love isn't always easy or perfect. It's messy. It's painful. But sometimes, it's worth fighting for. One evening, as we sat together watching an old family movie, my mother reached for my father's hand. He looked at her, surprised, but didn't let go. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Our family wasn't fixed, and maybe it never would be. But we were trying. And sometimes, that's enough.